This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial. And wow, this has been quite a week. I'm getting internet messages from Australia. There's a cold front, a very unusual cold front coming up from the Antarctic. And it's in the southern states of Australia, Victoria and southern New South Wales, is getting snow on trees and the landscapes that have never had snow in probably more than 100 years, or since settlement. And so all the crowds were out tobogganing down the roads, and the trees are laced with frozen ice, and it's cold. And these are people that aren't in a climate that is very cold, so they're not dressed appropriately. So I see here some mutterings about being cold, but it's kind of fun. The tobogganers, an older child will take a younger child and they'll slide down the hill. I strongly suspect that they don't have regular toboggans. The toboggans are probably plastic covers off of garbage bins or something like that, extemporaneously put together, and they're having fun. And it's not fun for the climate. It's a very cold climate, and that usually gets the creatures that are not used to it. Not too bad from a genetic point of view, because it gets the ones that are not adapted to the climate change, but I don't think this is an enjoyable event. It's a niche for people who are enjoying it, but it's not a popular event for the people, or the plants, I mean. It's interesting in Australia at the moment because Australia had a shutdown, and then all of a sudden it had a second level virus. And probably because somebody came back from England or Europe with some viral contact, and they met and in a crowd. And so now Victoria and New South Wales and South Australia are all shut down at the border. So some of my relatives that live on one side of a river and the border for New South Wales can't visit my sister, their mother, who's just a few miles away. If they do visit, they have to be in a 14-day quarantine. There are people who have farmland on both sides of the border, and so they're having problems as to how they handle their cattle. It's on river systems that are in the inland of Australia. What has happened is near where my relatives are, there's a mountain not too high, about 7,000 feet, and it channels coastal water that runs out to the Pacific Ocean into the hinterlands, and it does it through several dams. Well, this was in dry country, but people from California who knew this sort of landscape came to Australia and suggested that irrigation could happen. And so the dams are used to provide irrigation water. One of the problems is that every son of a gun along the corridor dipped into the river. So when it gets to South Australia and to the South Australian Bight, where it empties, there's almost no water left. So there's prior to the virus, there were problems, and the virus hasn't really helped. But they've been remarkably free of virus problems, that partially because most of the states in Australia are low volume humans. So it hasn't been a real problem. But in Victoria and New South Wales, Victoria has been the most dominant virus situation at the moment, and New South Wales some. But Australia basically has been very independent, but very much locked down, and it's been successful. They're watching it right now. And all the cold climate people are sending me videos of action, of trees, of pickup trucks and people getting together. And so all the friends and relatives are out there. And so this week, I've had some of those friends and relatives who actually are temporarily working in Washington have come visit. And so they were just here for a day and a half. Marilyn, the wife, and my niece, and Kieran, the husband, and Jackson, the 5-year-old son, who's very energetic. And so it's been kind of fun. One of the problems with me as a citizen is that I came in 1961, left my family behind, and they have hardly seen me at all in many, many years. So sometimes members of the family come to see who I am and what do I do. So we've been moving around the hinterland to let people see what Prairie is like. And at the moment, the liatress is very diplomatic and very good. So we've been up at Rantoul, and the family has gotten a good idea of what a prairie is. We went to the Kickapoo Trail. They understand trails. I have an evil thought in the background. It is that Albury, where my relatives are from, has a wonderful railroad retirement that goes up that Mount Kosciuszko, and it's a sort of national, probably international quality trail. So I'm been hoping that some of my relatives might join with the crowd and be part of that trail development, whether or not they live in Sydney or Melbourne or Canberra or Brisbane. It's something that is a national icon sitting next to a snowy mountain hydroelectric system that provides hydroelectricity and irrigation water. So it has tourist potential because there are hills and dales, and yes, the mountain itself does get snow, but never the bottomlands that are getting snow at the present time. We went to Monticello and the Railroad Museum and White Heath, where we're trying to get historic trains into Champagne. These are not piddly jobs. These are take years to do, and so they understand better what Monk has been doing, and so it's getting the family together and looking at memories. So we got on to Zoom and had 10 family members together, all talking together and enjoying Zoom. It's not the world's greatest answer to personal contact, but we were getting people together from many, many miles away from each other in Queensland, New South Wales, and in very different locations. And different people had different stories to tell and different comments to make. So that was interesting. We came back last night, and then we went to some of the structures that locally are rather interesting at the moment. They're man-made structures. One is on 2nd Street. It's a dig, detention pond, which catches water when it's at flood stage and then pumps it out slowly. And it has waterfalls and it has trails. And I have to give credit to the people who've designed it, because the people who are enjoying using that, I'd say 5 or 6 acre, 2 detention ponds and a lot of trails. So we've said goodbye, and you have to remember that I said goodbye to Australia a long time ago. And what we have done is to buy old railroad beds for prairie preservation, and that's been fairly serious and on a very limited amount of money. So we don't have the wherewithal to trip around the world, but it's meant that I haven't gone to England to see my relatives there, and that was kind of important to me. I was going to stay in the US for about 2 years to get a higher degree, and then go to see my relatives in England. These were the people who were settling the colonies. The sun never set on the English Empire, British Empire. And my grandfather brought his family, wife and family, to Australia, and they settled in a suburb of Sydney called Bondi. The relatives are still there, and this week there's been quite a bit of discussion because 2 of the retired people, husband and wife, named Garland, which was the history there is that Garland was a rather prominent artist, and he used to paint pictures of cattle and in the Scottish Highlands, and he was in galleries of note and at the right site for prominent artists. And so the family is still there, and this couple just went on a cruise of the Rhine and to Paris and to the some of the war situations, and came back. And then Wendy, the wife, felt sick, and it turns out that they're both. This was in December, but before there was really a virus alert, and they are still coming out of a virus situation, and it's not a very happy situation, and the continuing side effects are rather serious. So there was a letter from the Garland family to the Australian relatives, telling them that they were sorry to hear the Australian problems with virus, but they also have some of their own. And one of their friends died, and one of the relatives was in Perth. So they went to the funeral in England and went home, and they just got home 2 days before Perth closed down Perth is in Western Australia, and it closed its facilities, so they wouldn't have been able to come back in without serious quarantine. So you can see that the virus is still happening in Europe, and perhaps not as serious as it is in the US, where the Europeans tend to be more uniform in their rules and regulations. In the US, it has sort of been left up to different communities, and it's not overall, and each pocket can be a problem for overall pockets that are doing masks and other things. It affects children. In the Australian situation, where you have a school on one side of the Murray River, which is the border for New South Wales and Victoria, then they can't go across the river to school, and so the agriculture is the same, and so they commiserated with each other about that some. Uh, and one of the person involved was Kay Butcher, married to a German person who she probably met in Europe, but they're retired now, and she lives with my aunt and my mother's sister and her husband, and they were miners, so they were in the middle of Australia, Tennant Creek, just north of Alice Springs, and so the family had 3 children. They had to go 1,000 miles to school in Queensland because there were no schools locally for high school, especially. There's a rather wonderful radio broadcast school that will teach you at home remote, and so where there's no electricity, you had to get on a bicycle and generate your own electricity in order to get the radio message, and it's you mailed in your reports and things like that, and it has some of the connotations of what's going on with remote learning at the present time. So that reminds me of a lot of things in Australia, and so after we'd had a 10-person dialogue, I had a dialogue with my sister for about an hour, and we were back in a little town called Thora, and we were reminiscing about things that we haven't reminisced about sometimes at all. So this little town had a road from the coast where the coastal train was the North Coast Mail or the Brisbane Express, and that was the vital line, but there was a coastal plain and an escarpment. So our little town of Thora was at the bottom of the escarpment, and the escarpment was a little bit like moraines. It had little rivers that ran into a river that ran along the escarpment and then ducked out to the ocean. And we grew up with that sort of situation. My father was a one-teacher school teacher. My mother had been an artist. She came with her parents and 3 daughters in the 1913s, about then. And they had to actually dodge some German U-boats on the way, so it was getting near to wartime, and they had to go around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, then across with the roaring 40s, the winds that blew you across to Australia. The early clippers would have been windjammers. My grandparents and their 3 daughters came on a steamboat, but they went across the Bight and then arrived at Sydney Harbour. Sydney Harbour was an estuary, and they found a place in Bondi, which is famous for its beaches on facing the Pacific, but a drowned estuary, when you have the ice melt, it drowns landscapes. Sometimes the landscapes drop down too. So Sydney Harbour has a deep harbour, a rather wonderful harbour, with islands with the little mountains that were around the riparian basin, which is at first water-worn, but then flooded. And so there's lots of boating, lots of yachting, and the suburbs are set so that they're on those little mounds or hills of sandstone and slate and shale. Not very fertile territory, but developed to some extent, and ferries will take people from downtown Sydney across to various suburbs. So reminiscing about that, then my people grew up in Sydney and then moved to the country as school teachers. And my mother was having children at that time. And uh, then they moved to Thora, which they were initially on the uh, backside of this tectonic plate, which means that one plate of the universities moving up and over the other. And so this is Gondwana land, occupied by Aboriginal people that probably derived from Africa many millions of years ago. And then the bridge that allowed them to be in Australia was cut off by flooding water and islands. And so they became the native population of Australia. Very astute native people. They know how to track, they know how to do things to survive in a desert area. They're just very, very different. They're Stone Age people, and they had no resistance to the disease that convicts brought. The convicts were the early settlers because they could no longer be sent to the US. The US decided to be independent, and whereas England would send its prisoners to the US to do colonial developmental work, then they went elsewhere, and one of the prime places to send them was to Australia. So we are a kind of rough and tough heritage, and we did like everyone else too. We developed the landscape and utilized the resources, and without a great deal of reserve. Fortunately, it's not a very fertile country. Slates and shales that were under the ocean for a long time, and sandstones that were leached and not good agronomically. The Aboriginals, who are basically very friendly and communistic in their style, they shared their way of life with the early fleets, where the few military people and a bunch of convicts, and they were very helpful until they began to realize that these colonials were taking over their territory. So the flatlands that are in front of that escarpment, you can grow some things on, but there are native plants that you can utilize. And so the Aboriginals taught the convicts how to work. And the convicts couldn't go very far because they didn't know how to get over that escarpment. If they went up the creeks, they came to a blockage. If they went on the top, they came to a blockage where there was no place to go. So it was quite a few years before there were roads over the Blue Mountains. My people were at the Blue Mountains after they'd been in Gulf Creek, which is on the western plains and dry, at Thora, which was nestled under 2,000-foot mountains and was wet, and the Bellinger River went out to the ocean, and then they went to west of the Blue Mountains to a place near Lithgow, and then eventually to the lower Blue Mountains, in the hope that their children would be able to come back to Central Place. We did that to some extent. I taught in several different places that I would come back to. My brother was an engineer, and he did the same. My sister was a home economics teacher, and she did that too. So it was a good place to be. And eventually, though, we sold the site, which was a nice house put up in nature, so that part of the garden was manicured for vegetables and for flowers. My people love flowers. And part of it was nature, which is also quite intriguing because the native vegetation of Australia is unique. It's been separated from other landscapes from many, many centuries. And so little plants like Delwinia and the gum trees, eucalyptus trees, are pretty individual. And if you're an Australian file, many Americans go out to Australia and they fall in love with it just because of the landscape and the skyscape and the open nature and often a friendly atmosphere. Now, you'd like to also go to New Zealand, but New Zealand was settled more by an upper class, and the Maoris were there were much more sophisticated in modern terms than the Australian Aboriginals. They were Oceanians, and they filled into the bulk of people that are in the Pacific Islands, like Fiji and Tahiti and places like that. So I'm trying to figure out not how to leave that without telling you what has been going on. Part of it is that I'm here with a passion for trying to preserve the local vegetation. And many people, the two people that came in just recently, or just a few moments ago, to wonder what we do. And I'm doing that basically because when I came, I couldn't find the local ecosystem. And people didn't seem to know that prairie was their local ecosystem. It looks like weeds. I've been spending 6 generations getting rid of it. But if you're a geneticist, and I'm not necessarily a pure geneticist, but I am a scientist, an agricultural scientist enough to know that we need the biochemicals that are there. And if we persist in getting rid of organisms like bees and bumblebees or flies and all the hundreds and hundreds of insects out there that keep the biology going, then that's rather strange. And so I started to join people who were preserving prairie, and then got into it and settled down for many years. And so I've just been pulling out records where we morphed from doing artwork. The artwork was high contrast, and we would take photographs of prairie plants and allow people to imagine their involvement with such plants. We can't get people to go out into the boondocks and enjoy prairie. So the other alternative is to have bring artwork to them, and it sold well and kept us afloat for many years. We worked with the university and various departments that encouraged what we were doing. Then when the contingency money ran down, contingency money is money that goes to heads of departments so they can employ oddball people that do interesting things to do those interesting things. Well, that money sort of came to a halt for a while, and we'd been working within the community a lot. So we came to Champaign and occupied 3 or 4 relatively empty storefronts. The locals at that time had moved to the mall. The malls were popular. The Neal Street had a street mall. Neal Street was blocked off. You couldn't go straight through Neal Street. You had to go around and down something like Market Street, which was very awkward because Neal Street is a main drag going north and south from 74. But it was popular to go to the malls, and it developed at an exponential pace. It's almost like the planets couldn't plan fast enough for things to happen. And then 30 years, we started using this territory, and we morphed into buying railroad beds because in the 80s and 90s, there was a Steigers Act, which suggested that there were too many railroad beds. By this time, roads had come into action, and in Eisenhower administration time, there were big expressways going in. So there were still railroads, still mainline railroads, but the little railroads that serviced all these little towns 5 miles apart. So if you were 5 miles on one corridor, you were probably also 5 miles, a few miles from another railroad line. And they had small elevators and small sidings so you couldn't really get a big train together, and the rails were light and the ballast was light. And so if you were driving a, a train to pick up grain, if you came from Champaign and you went to Bonneville and Seymour and Whiteheath, and then you went down to Shady Rest and across the Sangamon, and then up to Lodge and on to Weldon and DeLand, or DeLand first, and then Weldon, and then Lane, and then Weldon Springs and Clinton. You could then go south to Decatur and come back from Decatur via Oriana and Cisco and into Monticello and back to Whiteheath, and then come back to Champaign. Well, it got to be the point that you had 2 engines picking up 15 cars, which wasn't very much. The mainline operators would like to have 150 cars, and now it's got up to about 200 cars. And so those lines were allowed to come out. If they had a derailment, that was an excuse for taking out the line. The lines were sold. Often the money went to multinationals and other businesses, but the lines were free, often for buying by locals. But if you got in first with a public action principle, then that was okay too. But you had to be hanging in there. I can remember sitting up in the Prudential building in Chicago for quite some time while people wondered why someone with a biology interest and trails interest would be trying to buy a railroad bed. And I was saying, give me 6 weeks or 6 months and we'll get the money. And we actually did get the money. And we did it in soon enough time that the bridges didn't get taken out by law. So we have 3 truss bridges, 23 trestles, and we got the railbed not totally intact because the Railroad Museum bought 7 miles. And so we're tacked on 2 ends of the Railroad Museum, and a 3rd end goes to Clinton. We need to give you maps and charts so that you can see this, but you can go to the Google Earth or something like that, and you can follow us through. We have, you will see a tree line where the invasive trees have grown, but the prairie is there, and so that is a land use in itself. So in 30 years, we have developed some trails. We have a nice trail at Monticello, and you have to know that this is agricultural land on very, very good soil. So every inch is valuable for agriculture. First livestock, then row crops, then very few row crops, just corn and soybeans and a little bit of wheat or barley here and there. We also started to take an interest in 25 miles between Urbana and Danville, and when no other agency did have the goal to be able to buy the line, we did the same sort of thing we did with Illinois Central. It was 33 miles. We guaranteed to buy the line and create, in this case, a more modern version, which was interim trail use, where bicycles are used to maintain a public corridor in order to maintain the right-of-way. Because if you waited 50 years and wanted to buy back a right-of-way between Danville and Urbana, because there were a factory put in or something like that, then you would be faced with a fortune. So $12 million came from the federal government for interim trail use. It's not likely to go back to railroading unless there is a big move to have a car factory or something in Danville, or some very important move. But that is the principle. If we're putting in the rail trail, and they're providing 12 million, and then as the state provides money, and the local organizations and local individuals provide money to put in things like toilets and parks that relate, and interesting roads. And that we've done, and some of the things we're doing may not happen for 200 years, but you need the skeleton to start with. So we've been involved with the skeleton, and I was interested to pull out an article that applauded what we were doing 30 years ago. Not that it was going to happen quickly. We do not want to move into territory where we're likely to have royal opposition. We're waiting till the rail-to-trail movement gets to be big enough to put rail trails across the country and have something like 30,000 miles of railroad trails that are owned by all sorts of individuals, but the rail trail movement coordinates and brings those people together, the owners and the managers and the CEOs and the vegetation and the biologists and the soil scientists that like to use those areas. So in effect, with my relatives here, I was justifying my existence here because it has taken me out of circulation, but into a different sort of circulation. So this is your choice. My wife got a PhD here and went to Tucson and got a very good job, but it cut across what I was doing. So we've been in distant places for many years. She's Australian too. She did a thesis on Australian Aboriginals, and that has been replicated by universities in Australia. And so she works with researchers and grad students, and they're looking at the populations of Australian Aboriginals that have kind of dwindled in most places, but expanded in others. And they've had a hard life. You hear about minority groups here, but we also have the same difficulty with Australian Aboriginals. Knowing all that, I was pleased to have relatives here and to meet up with genuine Australians. The couple of us here are working with they as young people. They joined respectively my niece Marilyn walked into a naval recruiting place, and when she was rather young, and joined up with the Navy, and her husband is at the age of 17 joined the Army, and they have similar backgrounds. They love to do things like skydive, and they got together and they have this rather active son whose name's Jackson, and he's exploring the world at the age of 5 and is very game to do so. Interesting that he can do that, but it's not quite so easy for women to do that. So the girl children, and particularly my sister Dorothy, a daughter of Phyllis Kathleen Alborough Monk, and she was English and married to my father, and she kept her thumb on my sister because girls didn't do this. Well, if you go to many countries in the world, girls don't get to do a lot. But the last 30 years, there's been progress made and continues to be made. And it's really nice to see women doing things that they never thought they could do before. And sometimes they do them better than men. A lot of the World War II data-based things were done by women. Women shuttled planes to places where they were used by forces, but they weren't allowed to to be in the live zone. So interesting how this kind of happens, and it's not something that's going to change really quickly, but my people are a part of that. And my niece is working with the Pentagon as sort of an ombudsman person, and her husband, Kieran, has been working remotely with the military, and he's gotten a bachelor's degree and a master's degree at the same time, and they're exploring the U.S. They can't be here for too long or they'll lose contact with their friends and relatives in Australia. It's like if I go back now, most of my friends and relatives are no longer in a place where we could get together and do interesting things. So I'm large part, American and still with Australian roots. So the Australian roots were surfacing this week. Now, at the same time, Liz Rodney was in town. Liz Rodney was here when we were developing these railroad lines. Early on, when there were the rails and ties were taken out, the beds were relatively free. It took about 6 hours to go from from Whiteheath to Clinton, but it was you could do it. These days it's somewhat overgrown, and so that meant that Liz Rudnick grew up got her degree here, and she's been a specialist in redundancy. That means that if you're on a plane and one thing doesn't work, then another thing will work and another thing will work. And so she has that expertise, but her avocation was often with helping us. So she and her husband and 2 children are located in the East, and she was coming here because her son is doing computer science here. And so we got together, and she has put together a website on the Prairie at Rantoul, and we were back and forth figuring out what to do. It's not enough to just have a radio program. We have to have pictures. This is a pictorial world, folks. And if I'm to convince supporters, including attorneys and people who can help us, then they're not in a position where they want to go look in the boondocks to find little pieces of prairie. They need us to take a picture of them. And so, in actual fact, we've often wondered about our storefront, which could be, it's adjacent to WEFT, it could be a visual part to WEFT. WIL has a visual corridor, and so you can listen to television. Its computerization is loaded with pictures, but the pictures can't just be rough, tough. People are doing that, but you need pictures that tell you what's going on, what is the genetics, what is the location, and I think I want to see Champaign come into a new world with the thought of $250 million venue south of university, to also think about the art that goes with nature, the nature itself. How do we work with history? So we're thinking of bringing in historic cranes, and we don't know where to put them. We don't know how they fit into a plan. Not everyone likes trains. Steam engine especially are very, very heavy, and they take a lot of energy to run them, and they have big wheels that break rails. So you need modern diesel engines, that also diesel has a polluting factor. So where would you bring a historic train? Or would you go back to horses, where horses used to actually pull uh, carts on tracks with people in them? And so we think about these things. And so as I was visiting uh, with my relatives, we were going to places like that. We went to the Railroad Museum, and the son got to see big stuff. These pieces of equipment, good size steam engine is heavy and huge wheels. You needed cranes to lift wheels, and you have a university railroad engineering department, which would do things like run wheels till they broke. And then you know what the problem was. You have to change the nature of the alloy that was making the wheels. You have to make sure that there are not little pieces in the wheels that allow the wheel to become a square wiggle and go clunk, 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 and break down the rails. It's one of the major railroad groups in the country, and uh, so we work with them to some extent because they have sometimes in an urban setting they might have a 200-foot easement right away, and other places where it's more narrow that might be down to 69 feet. But and you might have interurbans, which are really lightweight trains that came in with electricity in the 1900s. So what the Australians were learning was some of the same sort of things that go on in Australia, but at a more recent date, and not with quite the affluence, because here you have rain and you have soils and you have people that are often entrepreneurial, not just convicts. And so you're have some advantages that the rest of the world doesn't have. And so the rest of the world looks on the US to for ideas, and that's why we're here. That's why we get excited about things. And so my relatives were feeling their way around the locality, and I think they got an idea of what the Midwest is. It doesn't have 7,000-foot mountains, but it has flat and it has good soils that we don't know very much about, but we know a lot more than we did 100 years ago. We had this place was had a professor who the agriculture department at the federal level was not very excited about what he was doing. He wanted to map soils, and the University of Illinois decided that he read sense, and so Cyril Hopkins came to the University of Illinois, and he knew about the elements that were in the soil, and he had a formula which was Cyril Hopkins Cafe Mighty Good, and that covered most of the major elements that we have to use in agriculture. But he did good mapping, and he let people know what was a sandy soil and what was a clay soil, and he was a leader for the country in that sort of mapping. And so here in the boondocks, which is very flat, and you may not think it was exciting, there's been a lot of exciting. There's things like Netscape and Plato and Beckman and all sorts of things that make life interesting. And it's not just very formal. This is not where you only have a curriculum. There are people who are totally independent, and they do things that are different. I've been involved in that. I've chosen not to do a PhD, but I've picked up so much information from people for talking, and I just now had visitors come in from the front door, amazed at what we do here, asking questions, and perhaps even wanting to buy the building, because people have come back from the mall, and it's called gentrification. There's interesting happening, and the city is trying to keep some of the quality of old town. And so when buildings go up, the facades are kept, but the inside will be up to date. And you can see that off University Avenue near First Street. There's a building. There's a shell at the moment, but it's having its inside developed as a restaurant. So it's a place where people come and they come back to, and we have associations which are like extended families, and so I get a call from someone who needs has worn out the T-shirt over many years. Can we have another? And I've been hunting for a T-shirt, and I'm out of large and medium, so I have to order up some more T-shirts because they have an image on them which says, "Grow it, don't mow it." And so we have philosophies that not everyone agrees to, but the roadsides throughout Illinois are beginning to become roadsides that are interesting. You drive along them and there is blue stem, there's compass plant. You can see, as you're going fast, you can see the flocks and you can sort out the ecology. And that's why we get into a 10-mile strip between Rantoul and Paxton for a prairie trail. And if I look to contractors, we've this week had a contractor. They're a family. There's 4 generations of them. The grandfather was the city planner for Rantoul, and the children are doing interesting things. And we're tying into their contractual services to ask them to if they could help with the Pope Prairie. They contacted us first with the attempt to buy our prairie, and I had to explain that. Excuse us, but this is a prairie, and we've been working with it, we and others, for 80 years, and will take another 200 years probably to fill in. It was a gravel pit, and it grows back to action slowly, and little organum out of here, and a few more different species, and from the remnants around it. And it's there to encourage the Department of Transportation to put in a trail and not to put in a new trail. It's always cheaper to take out the old and put in new according to the new regulations. But this is an archaeological thing. This is a historic trail. It took you 3 months. I'm sorry, 3 days to get from Chicago to southern Illinois with a bullock team and muddy road. Then gradually it got to be a highway for T-model Fords and Chevs and whatever. And then it got retired because it was too narrow for modern problems. So the Route 45 is now modern. It runs parallel. And there you have space. You have space for what was going to be an extended leg of 45. Didn't happen because 57 went in and took most of the traffic. So the traffic is light, so you can have runoffs and kiosks and artwork and some grant money. And so we're thinking to buy a little extra 5 acres. It'll cost us about $50,000. And we're thinking of doing a Kickstarter or something like that to buy that corridor, that piece of the corridor, which will make the key to the 10 miles. And the more it gets to be popular and the more people use it, then the more we're likely to have a trail to Paxton, which is a rather unique Scandinavian town with a existing main street, and we have a little prairie there what used to be the old county nursing home. It was always about a mile out of town, so you didn't want to have everyone stumbling over people who were not able. So county farms or county homes were usually about a mile out of town, and they did have a farm, and sometimes they had prairies that we planted, and some of those prairies have retained themselves. So we still have that evil mind of taking people off Route 57 at Kankakee and having EQ2s come south. And so I took my people on side traps where you could move across the rolling nature of the Bloomington Moraine and past a golf course, past a landfill that could be prairie, and past rolling lands that can't be used for agriculture because they're too rambunctious. So there's contour plowing and there's things to be learned there. And the Grand Prairie Friends has some part of this. 1 mile of railroad prairie, and then sometimes it happens that there's nice little pieces that are around. So this week there's a tax sale, and there's a little piece of prairie that's left associated with the railroad. The farmer that was there passed, and the sons and daughters sold the farm, but there was this little piece that was left, and I think it was purposefully left so that we could preserve some native soil and native vegetation. So we have to think about whether we can bid on that thing. The taxes haven't been paid on it fairly purposefully, and now it's left for the county to sell it, and we have to pay the price of the taxes that haven't been made, and then keep it for its bacteria and fungi. And some people would tell us that that's not a good idea. It could be corn and soybeans. But anyway, we've been working at it, folks. And keep your eye on the prairie. If you want to look at the Rantoul, you go 1 mile north of Rantoul to Section Road 3200, and you'll go in just a few hundred feet, and you'll see a nice yellow gate, which is a heavy-duty gate. It costs the Department of Transportation $1,000. So it's a good gate, and other people have donated fence lines and put them in. The Ron Sleater has been there doing that sort of thing, and spot herbiciding the invasive species, and rather wonderful. He's got a little prairie in Iowa, and he's donating it to the natural resources people, historic people that are going to look after it in perpetuity. So we're looking at something like the same for Rantoul, and he's so pleased because the plants that are on the remnants are just biodiverse. You see thimbleweed here and rosinweed there, and even though the compass plants are high and you can see them, and the grasses are all high, there's the plants are there. And if you're not a prairie nut, you won't necessarily get switched on by this site. But if you're a prairie nut, you have to know that that's a damn good prairie, and it's unique for what we have around. And we hope it will stay around, and we'll talk with those contractors, and we'll tidy up some of the junky stuff and make it more attractive, and put in seats and whatever, and a kiosk with a species list, and we'll be with it, but it has to go to another generation and another generation, and it's hard for people to think 200 years, but we want people who are involved, especially families. Some of those farmers are realizing that big corporations are taking over the agriculture, so they're doing things to make sure that their farmland doesn't get taken over. So they're forming trusts and the like to make sure that they're small farmers. Small farms still big. You need about 3,000 acres to make the farm work these days. But I think we're getting near to the end. So this is Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And remember that WEFT provides this opportunity for us to talk to you. And Banner Public Television provides not only that, but we put pictures in here, and we work with dropping in things, and we might have a blog. There's a lot of work to do. And if some of you would like to work at some of these things, we could use your help. Some of us are getting old enough that we can't throw railroad ties around anymore. So just see what you can do. Go to Rantoul, go 1 mile north of Rantoul on 45, and then find your way onto Old Road 45 and just walk around the prairie. We don't have a trail around it. You'll stomp on a few plants because you can't tell where not to stomp on. But you'll see the open spaces where the gravel pit was, and you'll see to the south, the remnant prairies, and across the old road to the interurban where there are prairie plants too. And you'll see the birds, and you'll see the cicadas. Prairie cicadas are making their noise at the moment, and they're totally different from the forest cicadas that you get in town. And it's a joy to be there. There's a lot of work to do, and we hope some of you will be interested from time to time, not only in that particular spot, but we have all sorts of other spots to go to too. And it's part of a total community, and it's part of a heritage. This was your ecology, and we should preserve this. So thanks for listening. Be active. This is Dave Monk, a Prairie Monk, and thanks to my relatives for coming, and check it out on the Monk.